Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special lecture by Jasmine Fledderjohann. And I'm very glad to welcome her. She's going to talk about the intersection of food insecurity and reproductive justice as part of ad hoc group 3 now. We have recently become group number 3 from 5 because of logistical reasons of the Indian Sociological Society. And this is our monthly lecture in the month of March 2025. We couldn't have a lecture in February because of certain reasons, and therefore I'm very happy that we are resuming our lecture series. I see that a lot of our RC members are also here, many young scholars, and perhaps you would like to interact with Yasmin once her lecture is done. So let me very quickly introduce the speaker. She is a professor in sociology and social justice at Lancaster University. And since 2020, she has been leading the Food Security for Equitable Futures project, a UKRI funded Future Leaders Fellowship examining the consequences and measurement of food insecurity in global majority countries. Her ongoing work from the project explores the consequences of food insecurity for reproductive justice globally. Additional ongoing work introduces the concept of algorithmic reproductive justice, exploring how problematic trends in emerging digital technologies are producing reproductive injustices, particularly for multiple marginalized people. She has previously worked on how survey instruments socially construct what she terms the invisible infertile, marginalized individuals who experience infertility but who face barriers to receiving social support and medical care because their infertility falls outside of the dominant reproductive imaginary of who can and should reproduce. So, Yasmin, I welcome you to this lecture and the ad hoc group 3 on food, culture, and society of the ISS. And I hope that you will enjoy the talk and then the further interaction with particularly a young group of scholars who are working on different aspects of food.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I would love to be in India, but at least to join virtually, it's my pleasure. So as you've rightly said, this is part of the Food Security for Equitable Futures project, which is funded by UK Research and Innovation. And I'd like to start by acknowledging my collaborators on this project, who are also the field team. So none of the empirical data that I'm going to be presenting today would be possible without the really hard work of the 3 researchers that you see here. So Swayamshri, Ankita, and Charamita, listed in alphabetical order here, are both collaborators on the paper and really hugely important to the success of the project as well. So I have 2 aims today. One is to conceptually link food insecurity and reproductive justice. And then the second is to start thinking about how we can apply that conceptual framework through using some preliminary qualitative evidence from India. So food insecurity, if we think about the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition, FAO's definition of food insecurity, is difficulties accessing enough safe and nutritious food to support a healthy life. And it's not a static, dichotomous situation, but rather a dynamic gradient. So we know food insecurity can vary in terms of its severity. The figure on the right here is showing the food insecurity experience scale, how FAO conceptualizes that scale, right? So this is a common survey measure used to measure food insecurity. So if we think about mild food insecurity, this involves things like worrying about where you might be able to get food, worrying about whether you're going to have enough food. When we move into more moderate food insecurity, we see people starting to do things like swapping out food items. Maybe they'll take more expensive food items and swap them out for less expensive food items, reducing quality, reducing quantity of food, maybe even starting to skip some meals. And then when we move into severe food insecurity, we see people going perhaps a full day or even longer without any food at all. So it can vary in terms of severity. It can also vary in terms of duration. So we might see people who experience sporadic food insecurity. It happens now and then. Maybe they have fluctuation in wages, but it's not very predictable. We might see seasonal food insecurity. So it might happen in a regular, predictable pattern. For example, if I am waiting for harvest time each year for a certain crop. Or it might be a chronic part of my everyday life, something that I've been living with on a regular basis for an extended period. In terms of levels of food insecurity, again, these data come from FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. This is showing the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. So again, in other words, when people start swapping out food items, maybe skipping meals, maybe even going without food altogether. So moderate or severe food insecurity. And this is showing data from 2019 through 2023. The figure that you see here is the world prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. So we know in 2019, about a quarter of the global population was experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity. So already that's quite stark. But then, of course, we all know that COVID exacerbated difficulties with food insecurity, exacerbated levels of food insecurity. So unsurprisingly, in 2020, we see a spike in food insecurity rising to nearly 30%. And it stays right around that 28-29% level throughout this observation period. I'm now going to show you the figures both for Southern Asia excluding India and Southern Asia including India. And the reason that I'm doing that is because FAO aren't able to publish the figures for India itself. So we'll make a little inference looking without and with India included in the figures. So the top line here is now showing the figure for Southern Asia excluding India. So you can see in the beginning of the observation period here in 2019, there was already a little bit of a gap where the prevalence of food insecurity was a little higher in Southern Asia compared to the world figures. But we see that the increase in food insecurity associated with COVID is much higher, right? It's much starker. So then we see more than a third of the population, 39%, experiencing food insecurity in 2020. And we do see a slight increase continuing across this period. If we then add India into the figures for the region, this is the top line here now, we see that the gap is even higher between the world and the region, right? So we can infer here that food insecurity levels in India were higher than for the region, right? So already more than a third of people in the region were experiencing food insecurity in 2019. We again see a spike with COVID, but then interestingly, we see that rate start to fall and come in line with the region, including India and excluding India, right? So by the time 2022 and 2023 come, those figures have leveled off, suggesting that India is really online with the rest of the region by 2022. So we know that food insecurity remains a really pressing problem, both globally and within India. And one of the narratives that is really commonly advanced and has been for several decades now is that food insecurity is a problem of overpopulation. So I'm going to pick a little bit specifically on Paul Ehrlich here for his book, The Population Bomb, which is one of the places where we've seen this rhetoric come out really strongly. So in the prologue to the 1986 edition of his book, he says the battle to feed all of humanity is over, right? This is quite a stark statement to begin with. Although many lives could be stretched through programs to stretch carrying capacity, in other words, the idea that we have only so many resources to provide for the world's population, right? The Earth can only produce so much food. These programs will only provide a stay of execution if they're accompanied by successful efforts at population control. So he is directly saying here, the only way that we're going to solve the problem of food insecurity is population control, right? It's a problem of overpopulation. He then goes on in the introduction, so this is page 1 of the book, and he specifically looks at India in the opening of this book. So he says he's long understood the population explosion intellectually. He says, I came to understand it emotionally one stinking hot night in Delhi a few years ago. The streets seemed alive with people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing and screaming, thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, defecating and urinating, clinging to buses, herding animals. People, he says. And he says, as we move slowly through the mob, hand horns squawking, the dust, noise, heat, and cooking fires gave the scene a hellish aspect. This is really strong, really dehumanizing language. And so he's problematizing reproduction, and particularly he's focusing on Indian reproduction here in the opening of the book as a threat to humanity's food supply. So I want to suggest today that there is a better and more productive way that we can think about food insecurity, which is to think about food insecurity as a matter of reproductive justice rather than being a population problem, right? And when we think about food insecurity as a matter of reproductive justice, we begin to see that population control is not the solution to food insecurity. Part of this comes from the fact that reproductive justice tells us that it is unjust to violate the reproductive rights of individuals in order to be able to solve collective issues, right? This is a world problem. This is not the problem of individual people who need to restrict their fertility, right? And this is true even where resources are constrained, right? This isn't to say that food insecurity isn't a problem, but the solution is not this idea of overpopulation and population control. Another thing that reproductive justice reminds us is that marginalized people, historically and now, are the first people to have their rights violated. So reproductive justice asks us to center on the experiences of marginalized people. And it also highlights the way that exactly this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric that we've seen from Paul Ehrlich is really often used to support really problematic policies that violate the rights of marginalized people. So it's sort of flipping the rhetoric on its head when we think about it in terms of reproductive justice. So reproductive justice, for those who aren't familiar, is both a framework and a movement. It was an activist movement started in 1994 by a group of Black feminist activists in the United States. And what was different from existing reproductive rights movements in the US was that they took a broader view of what the reproductive violations and issues were. They specifically learned from women in the global South, and instead of using the US Constitution like a lot of reproductive rights movements were doing at the time, they drew on international human rights frameworks, which makes it a highly portable framework for use. And they said at that time in 1994 that everyone has three core rights: the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. There's been subsequent work within the activist community and among academics, including activists at Sister Song, which is one of the leading reproductive justice organizations. And they've added a fourth right to this list and said, additionally, everyone has the right to control our bodies and futures, which I'm going to use a shorthand, bodily autonomy, to refer to this for the rest of the talk. So Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger. Loretta Ross is one of the founding mothers of the movement. Ricky Solinger is a historian. In their 2019 book, they introduce the language of choiceless choices. And they say society, in principle, offers a marketplace of reproductive options, right? I can decide whether or what kind of contraception I want to use. I can make decisions about if and when to have children, how I want to deliver children, how I want to raise them, right? There's a marketplace of reproductive options, and it assumes that reproductive decision-making is just about me as an empowered individual making a choice from this wonderful buffet of options, right? But what they argue in their book is that actually not everyone has access to the same choices, and reproductive justice helps us to understand and see that clearly. So some people have to choose between a range of undesirable options, and they label this making choiceless choices, right? Making choices between a really structurally constrained set of limited choices. So building from that work, my colleagues Sophie Patterson, Marina Wino, and I wrote a chapter in 2023, an article in 2023, articulating pathways using existing literature from social science, public health, thinking about what are the actual barriers to reproductive justice that we see when we think about food insecurity. So food insecurity has long been identified as a potential issue to reproductive justice, but the specific pathways, the specific reasons that we think reproductive justice might matter, or food insecurity might matter for reproductive justice, hadn't been articulated. So this isn't an empirical paper, it's articulating those pathways. And we're advancing a core argument that food insecurity is a threat to reproductive justice globally. We show the various ways that it leaves people to face choiceless choices. And we focus in this paper on the first three rights, so the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. We didn't come to the issue of bodily autonomy in this paper. So now I want to just very briefly talk through some of the pathways that we discuss in that paper, focusing first on the right to not have a child. So first of all, we know that food insecurity from existing literature, we know that it is linked to a risk of intimate partner violence. And it also makes it more difficult for people to leave violent situations. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, if you are struggling to make ends meet already, how are you going to establish yourself elsewhere? What resources are you going to use to leave a violent relationship? We also know food insecurity is associated with restricted sexual autonomy in partnerships, and particularly things like difficulty accessing and using contraception, such as negotiating condom use. So this carries with it a risk of pregnancy, which is potentially a violation of the right to not have a child. We also know food insecurity is associated with potentially entering into sexual relationships for material support, perhaps for money in order to buy food, or perhaps directly for food itself. Again, here we see a risk of potentially unwanted pregnancy. And then sometimes people are pushed into criminalized activities in order to be able to access food when they experience food insecurity. So Ross and Salinger call this survival crimes, anything that you might do that's considered criminalized within the context that you're living in, right? That might be sex work, that might be theft, anything that would be considered criminal and carries with it the risk of incarceration, right? And so we know that the risk of incarceration in turn makes it more difficult to access reproductive health care, including relevant to this right to not have a child, access to abortion care. Additionally, food insecurity is really closely tied to what we term in the paper choiceless spending choices, right? So the idea here is that when I'm having difficulties accessing food, I have to make difficult decisions between spending money on food or spending money on other necessities. So relevant to this, right, is the treat or eat phenomenon. So this is something that's widely known in the food insecurity literature, which is that people often experience difficulties where they have to decide between spending money on medicine or medical care and spending money on food, right? So the treat or eat, which do I spend the money on? So relevant to the right to not have a child, this takes the form of choosing between food expenses and abortion care costs. And these sorts of trade-offs are true even when you have free medical care at the point of care, right? So even if I don't have to pay for the appointment, there's still something called chain of care costs that are associated here, right? So we think about things like, how do I get to the appointment? Are there transport costs associated with that? Do I have to miss a day of work? Am I going to have lost wages? Is my employer going to be upset with me for missing work? And is that going to impair my ability to get future work, right? So there are costs beyond the healthcare itself that are involved in these sorts of trade-offs. Turning now to the right to have a child, we know food insecurity is really strongly associated with malnutrition. So food insecurity can lead to caloric deficits, macronutrient deficits, micronutrient deficiencies. In turn, this matters for the right to have a child because it's associated with difficulties conceiving and even infertility. And additionally, it makes it more difficult to carry a healthy pregnancy to term. It carries health risks with it throughout pregnancy. Choiceless spending choices are also relevant here. So again, not only potentially costs for healthcare where that applies, but even where there are free systems, chain of care costs for accessing things like prenatal care, antenatal care, and other reproductive healthcare that's needed. Again, food insecurity association with restricted autonomy and sexual partnerships matters here, as does it matter for sexual relationships for material support. Both of these carry with them the risk of sexually transmitted infections, which is in turn linked to infertility and difficulties conceiving. Likewise, we see the relevance of food insecurity's links to survival crimes here and the potential risk of incarceration associated. So in very few carceral systems in the world are you able to try to conceive with your partner while you are incarcerated, right? So you're not able to try to conceive. And even if you've come into prison pregnant, we know that prisons are places where there's delivery in inhumane conditions, unsanitary, unsafe conditions, which is a threat to the right to have a child. It's also hugely important for the right to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. So again, food insecurity's links to malnutrition matter here, right? Nutrition is hugely important for children's survival and growth throughout gestation, right? Throughout pregnancy and also throughout childhood. So malnutrition is associated with diabetes, anemia, reduced immunity, right? So susceptibility to infectious diseases, micronutrient deficiencies, which can carry with it the risk of illnesses such as rickets, and up to and including mortality, right? And then likewise, food insecurities association with intimate partner violence and difficulties leaving violent situations are hugely impactful for both parents and children, right? Violence within the household, we know, can have lasting physical and emotional impacts across the life course for both parents and children. So it makes it impossible to parent your children with dignity in safe and healthy environments. Likewise, where people are engaging in survival crimes, this carries a risk of incarceration. Of course, it's very difficult to parent your child if you have been separated from them by the state, right? And it also means that once you're released from prison, you may have more difficulties accessing things like safe, suitable housing and employment that are necessary to be able to provide your child with a safe and healthy environment. And then again, choiceless spending choices are relevant here as well. I've talked a little bit about treat or eat already. There's also a phenomenon from the food insecurity literature called heat or eat. We might think of it more as energy costs or eat, right? So whether that's cooling your home or heating your home, being able to provide a safe and healthy environment might be paired off against the cost of food, right? Additionally, people might compromise on the quality of their housing and the quality of the neighborhoods that they're living in, again, compromising the right to be able to provide a safe and healthy environment. So this has been a very quick, sweeping overview of quite a lot of complex pathways between food insecurity and reproductive justice. I'm not going to go through every pathway that you see in the figure here, but I do want to highlight that even with this sort of complex figure here, this is an illustrative rather than an exhaustive list of possible pathways, right? We've noted in the paper itself that we aren't able to cover every single pathway. There are probably pathways that we haven't covered in the paper. And I would include in that all of the pathways to the right to bodily autonomy. So remember, I said that we only covered the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. So I just want to very briefly talk about some of the linkages to the right to bodily autonomy as well now. So we can think about intimate partner violence, restricted sexual autonomy, and entry into sexual partnerships for material support. All of these we know is linked to food and are linked to food insecurity, and they are all directly violations of the right to bodily autonomy, right? If I can't keep my body safe from violence, if I can't make decisions about the kinds of relationships that I'm entering into and the terms of those relationships, that's a violation of my right to bodily autonomy. Choiceless spending choices are also relevant in this context, right? Particularly when people are making bodily sacrifices in order to be able to cover costs. And I'm including in here things like surrogacy and reproductive donation that might be undertaken in order to be able to provide basic necessities for your family. Malnutrition and its links to food insecurity are also relevant here, right? If I can't meet my body's basic needs, that's a threat to my right to bodily autonomy. And then likewise, survival crimes and their risk of incarceration are also relevant here. So if I am incarcerated, my freedom has been restricted, but also we know around the globe, prisons are places that are rife with sexual abuse and sexual assault. And this is also a threat to the right to bodily autonomy. Okay. So that's been quite a quick introduction to conceptual links between food insecurity and reproductive justice. I now want to turn to the empirical side and think a little bit about what do we do with this framework? What does it help us to understand looking at data? So the data for this come from the Food Security for Equitable Futures project. Our team have collected about 2.5 rounds now. We're in the process of collecting the third round of data in 2 states. These are longitudinal data for a subset of our households. So we focused on UP and Goa, and we collected data, the team collected data from multiple members of each household, including children as young as 7. So anyone in the household age 7 plus was invited to participate in the interviews. In the first wave, which was collected in December 2022 to March 2023, the team interviewed 87 households, right? This is a huge undertaking. And because they were interviewing multiple members of each household, that yielded 429 interviews. So this is a really staggering level of data, right? Wave 2 was collected last autumn, and wave 3 is currently being collected. So the team are in the field right now, began in February. We used a mix of purposive, random walk, and snowball sampling. And the reason that we did this is we aren't particularly interested in generalizability. What we really want to understand is the different contexts in which people are living, the different aspects that might have relevance to their lives, and how that might matter for food. So we focused on diversifying by caste, by religion, and by type of family structure. So both joint and single family households, and also households that are potentially multi-generational, where there are grandparents, parents, and children living in a household, single parent households, and traditional families. For the sake of the presentation today, I'm just going to focus on wave 1 because those are the data that are currently transcribed, and we still have some data being collected in round 3. We have 3 different kinds of data. So we have some roster data. We asked for sociodemographics for all household members, and then we collected some data on household characteristics as well. So things like infrastructure, water, toilets, these sorts of things, income for the household. We have the semi-structured interviews, which is the main thing that I'm going to focus on today. So that was collected using age-specific guides for children aged 7 to 13, 13 to 17, and 18 plus. And all of these data were collected by the fantastic field teams, Swimeshri, Ankita, and Charu. We asked them questions, or I should say the team asked them questions about their experiences with food, employment, care work, schooling. These varied a little bit depending on the age of the participants, and each guide reflected a little bit of difference there. But these are broadly speaking the types of topics we're covering. And then also everyone who completed the structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, were administered the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. This is FAO's measure for food insecurity. It's a survey measure of food insecurity. And then we used a modified version of that for children as well. And then I'll also be drawing on observations from the field team. So they've collected some observations as they've been in the field. So one of the themes that is already starting to emerge, and I want to emphasize this is a really preliminary data analysis that I'm sharing with you, but already we're starting to see the relevance of this framework looking at the links between food insecurity and reproductive justice. So one of the themes that we're seeing is women sacrificing their bodies, right? So many women talked about their bodily well-being being in direct competition with children's well-being, not necessarily exactly in that language or those terms, but we see, for example, women talking about how they made sure their children were fed before they ate themselves, sometimes to the detriment of their own nutrition, right? So for example, in this excerpt, the interviewer is asking if everyone eats together, and the participant says, no, we have never eaten together in my life, right? So she explains that she gets the children to eat, they have as much as they want, they go to sleep, and then she looks after her own food needs either, right? Later after that, right? So she might eat some rice, she might have some lassi, but she's having a more restricted meal. Women also talked about the ways that they were wearing their bodies out physically, right? So there were a lot of women who were responsible for household budgets, and so they had to think about how to cut costs, how to earn income, and how to make sure that the family could afford basic necessities. One of the ways that many women did this was instead of cooking on using gas cylinders, they were cooking on chulas. And this carried with them, we know from the public health literature, carries a risk of health difficulties, not only for women themselves, but also potentially if they have small children around with them while they're cooking, health difficulties for children as well, risk of respiratory illnesses. So we see here, for example, a participant saying that she has a chula and it's inside the house. She does open a gate while she's cooking to try to let some of the smoke out. The interviewer says, okay, so it's near the gate, so some of the smoke goes outside, and the participant confirms some of it goes outside, some of it comes inside. So she's confirming here that she is experiencing some smoke exposure in the process of cooking while she's trying to cut costs. A lot of women also talked about taking on really intensive, exhausting, grueling, heavy manual labor. And this was true even of women who were fairly far along in pregnancies, right? So this participant is talking about how she's 5 months pregnant, but she still does all of the work, right? She says, I do all types of work. Nobody is there to help me. I will have to do all the work. I have to wash the clothes also. 5 months pregnant I am, right? So she's clearly concerned about all the physical labor that she's doing at this late stage in her pregnancy. Choiceless spending choices also came up quite a bit in our data. So many women talked about rising food prices and the sort of general unaffordability of life and basic necessities. So for example, a participant here is talking about scarcity of money, and she says we can get rations, but we don't have money, so from where will we feed, right? They're able to get rations, but not much else. Many women also talked about making compromises on the foods that they were purchasing and preparing. So they would switch to cheaper food items or cut food items out. These are really strong indicators of moderate food insecurity. So one woman here is saying, if anything is expensive, we don't make it, we make something else in its place, right? We can't afford to make expensive food. And linked to this, we saw a lot of evidence that dietary diversity was quite limited. So the interviewer here is talking to the participant about foods that she likes, and she said that she likes fruit. So the interviewer says, do you eat fruit? And the participant says that she feels like eating it, but she said, you can't buy it because of money, so I don't eat it, right? She's getting only food that's enough. She's meeting her basic caloric needs. So we saw fruit come up a lot. We also saw protein sources, dairy sources coming up quite a lot as foods that people were doing without. Thinking thinking a little bit about the observational data, the team observed that there were many families who were living in insecure, unsanitary, and temporary housing. So, for example, housing where they had plastic sheeting for roofs, housing where there were washrooms, as you can see in the picture here, washrooms that were right next to cooking facilities, lack of access to things like water, regular water sources, toilets, cooking facilities, and this made it really difficult for households to be able to get by day to day. The team also observed in all rounds, they've observed widespread seasonal diseases, right? So things like dengue and malaria. And alongside this, we've also seen evidence of treat or eat trade-offs, or I'm actually going to change the language a little bit and say, in fact, what we're observing is treat nor eat. So Snell and colleagues have argued that, in fact, for many families, it's probably a bit misleading to talk about treat or eat, because in fact, it's not that they're choosing between medical care or food, it's that they're able to afford neither one, right? So treat nor eat. And we see this illustrated, for example, in the excerpt here. So the participant is saying, if you have money, you can buy anything and eat anything. But she says, work is becoming a bit more of a problem. And so we're unable to buy medicines also, nor are we able to get food items, right? So treat nor eat. We also, and this is one of those pathways that we didn't talk about in the pathways paper, right? This is something that we're actually learning from the data itself, but while thinking about links between food insecurity and reproductive justice, which is what we're calling choiceless marriage choices. So we are finding some evidence of early marriage for girls, and that this is directly linked to scarcity and food insecurity, right? That this is a way that households are trying to address food insecurity. So as one example, there was a mother who knew that her eldest daughter, who had been married young, was facing intimate partner violence in her marriage. She was very distressed about this. She wasn't happy about the situation, right? But despite this, she wanted the daughter to continue with the marriage rather than returning home. And when she explained why, she very simply said, I have more mouths to feed, right? So they were still experiencing food insecurity, and she simply couldn't afford to bring the daughter home. Another example comes from a woman who was 20 years old when the team spoke to her. She was pregnant and she was married. And in her natal home, she had experienced food insecurity and economic hardship. And because she was the eldest, she had married young. She's now the mother to a 4-year-old daughter. And she also talked about how she was experiencing food insecurity and scarcity in her current home, in her marital home. And she felt really strongly that these choiceless spending choices had meant that she wasn't able to access the prenatal and neonatal health care that she should have been accessing. And that this contributed strongly to the fact that she had had 4 miscarriages and her 12-month-old child had died. And she was really worried about the pregnancy that she was currently carrying as well. We're also seeing evidence of links between food insecurity and violence, and really particularly coercive control. So we talked a bit in the Pathways paper about links between food insecurity and violence, but what's emerging from the data here is also that food is being directly used as a tool of coercive control. So we can see in the excerpt from an interview on the left, the participant is talking about how there are 4 children. She's talked a little bit earlier in the interview about how she's experiencing intimate partner violence. And she says, what would I do? The police, would have put him in the police station. In the end, why should I suffer? The interviewer asks, what did you say to the police? And the participant says, what is there to say, right? He drinks, he beats the children, he beats me also, and he doesn't let me eat. We also see in the interview on the right, we found some evidence of food specifically being used to punish women for having girls, right? So the participant here is talking about differences between her experiences living with her in-laws, and she and her husband and their children have moved now. So comparing the lifestyle where she's living now to living with her in-laws. And she says now the lifestyle is good, but when she was living with her in-laws, there were problems, right? She says everyone was beating her. They didn't give her food and drink. And the interviewer clarifies they don't give food and drink. She says, yes, as I had a daughter, so they beat me more. Earlier, they used to beat me less. And the interviewer clarifies again, you had a daughter, that's why. And the participant confirms, yes, that's why. I do want to emphasize as well, reproductive justice really calls on us to think about marginalized groups and center their experiences. So one of the groups that our team have interviewed and worked with are migrants. who are particularly at risk because they are unable to access the public distribution scheme. And I mean here particularly interstate migrants. So we saw a lot of migrant families in Goa who had moved from other states. And so their ration card was registered in a different state, which means that exactly at the same time when they were sort of cut off from their social networks that might have been a source of support for them at home, they were simultaneously falling through government safety nets because of the registration process for their cards. The other group that really came to the foreground as being sort of marginalized through these connections and processes is young girls, adolescent girls, right? There were quite a few adolescent girls that the team spoke with who had limited autonomy and limited stability. So some girls were married to cope with household food insecurity and precarity, and sometimes they were married into precarious households, right? So they weren't escaping food insecurity and precarity through their marriages. They were also experiencing intimate partner violence, and sometimes they were even asked to leave those homes, right? Asked or forced to return to their natal home by husbands and in-laws. So experiencing a lot of instability and quite limited autonomy. I also want to emphasize that food sacrifices were not universal, right? Not everyone said they were experiencing food insecurity. Some families we spoke with, while yes, they talked about problems with things like unemployment, things like accessing affordable and suitable housing, they ultimately said that they were still comfortable. They were still able to make ends meet. Some households did say that, yes, we're experiencing food insecurity. Things are really difficult. They definitively said, yes, this is something we're struggling with. But some households experienced scarcity and experienced food insecurity, but also couched that and said, actually, we have enough food, right? Things are difficult, but we have enough. And it's possible that this is reflecting some amount of efforts to dispel stigma, right? We know that food insecurity is really quite stigmatizing. Some of our participants found the questions quite upsetting, actually. And also, it's possible that they're reflecting some acceptance of everyday precarity, right? So it may just be that when food insecurity is a part of your everyday life, you accept that this is just part of what life is. This is how life is, right? So, for example, we saw some families talking about nutritionally inadequate meals. So, if we think about in terms of guidelines for what we need for a balanced meal, one example of this is on the left here. We need a diverse range of foods. We need protein sources, carbohydrate sources, fat sources, right? But many households talked about regularly eating meals of things like roti with salt or potatoes with salt or rice with salt and labeled this as being enough, right? So one example here is from an interview where a participant is talking about, she said, yes, they're having difficulties and they're having worries about food, but she clarifies and she says, it's not that I'm sitting and thinking, what should I make? And there's nothing, right? So she's saying, we might have run out of lentils and we might have run out of vegetables, but there's flour and there's rice. There's something to be made, right? So the interviewer clarifies there's something there, and the participant says yes. She also has her mother-in-law as a resource, so she might go and borrow some foods from her mother-in-law. And if she can't get anything from her mother-in-law, she says, if it's not there, then I ate namak roti, right? She's eaten salt roti, she's eaten something. Okay. So just in this preliminary analysis already, we are finding evidence of numerous barriers to reproductive justice linked to food insecurity, right? So these dynamics that I've talked about with limited food intake, restricted dietary diversity, right? Women sacrificing their own food intake for the sake of other people in the household, families but not being able to access dairy, protein sources, right? Fruit. This carries with it risks of malnutrition, which then links, as I've mentioned earlier in the talk, to all of those reproductive rights, right? It carries with it the risks of infant and child mortality. It carries with it risks for healthy pregnancies, right? Risks to bodily autonomy. We also have found evidence of exposure to unhealthy environments, right? So things like smoke in the household, things like unsanitary and unsafe housing conditions, right? And this is associated, we know from public health literature, this is associated with chronic health conditions, with risks of fetal loss, intrauterine growth restriction, and so forth, right? So there are really strong health risks that threaten all of these reproductive justice rights. We're also finding evidence of treat nor eat, right, which again carries with it health risks for everyone in the household and all of this associated barriers to reproductive justice. And we're finding that evidence of early marriage, right? So we know that early marriage is associated with early childbearing, which in turn is potentially associated with infertility. We know that early marriage is associated with unintended pregnancy, limited bodily autonomy, intimate partner violence, which again has relevance to all of these rights that we're talking about. And then experiences of violence as well, which of course carries with it, amongst other negative repercussions, the risk of lasting physical and emotional trauma, risk of miscarriage, right? Again, threatening all of these reproductive justice rights. So I'm hoping that I have convinced you here that there's a good reason to decouple problems of food scarcity from the narrative of population control, right? It is not an issue of population control, it's a matter of reproductive justice. And I think a reproductive justice lens is helpful because it's a rights-based approach, and because it's a rights-based approach that centralizes the lived experiences of marginalized people who are too often the first who are sort of sacrificed for the sake of the collective good. We have used that Pathways paper that I mentioned with Sophie Patterson and Marina Wino. We've used that as a lens for conceptualizing the links between food insecurity and reproductive justice and thinking through these different pathways as we're looking through the data. But it's also been a really helpful reciprocal process, right? So as I say, we didn't mention all of the pathways in that paper, and we're starting to see some new pathways and putting some nuance onto those pathways through looking at some empirical data. So it's a reciprocal process where we're looking through the pathways conceptually, but then also feeding back to how those can be refined and nuanced. So things like choiceless marriage choices and thinking about food at itself as a tool of coercive control are things that have emerged out of the data that in turn have relevance for the conceptual model. I also want to highlight that our participants raised reproductive justice issues without prompts, right? We didn't go in asking questions about reproductive justice. We weren't asking reproductive histories, in fact. But food insecurity, food experiences, and experiences in our everyday reproductive lives are inextricably intertwined, right? So we came in asking questions about food, and people started talking about reproductive justice issues. The final thing that I want to emphasize is that this is a really preliminary analysis. This is at early stages. We're still going through the data. We've started with women's accounts here, and we're still at an exploratory stage. There's a really good scope for us to actually bring in other household members as well. As I said earlier, we have men, we have grandparents, we have children in these data. So we can really think about whole households using this reproductive justice lens because of the data that we have. So of course, further analysis is going to be needed. There's also, because we have 2 rounds of data and the team are in the process of collecting the 3rd round of data, there's the potential for us to look at change or lack of change in circumstances over waves as well. So I just want to say thank you. The art that was in the earlier slides is from the Megan Smith, from Megan Smith and the Repeal Hide Art Project. So thank you to Megan Smith and that art project. Thank you to the field team, without whom none of this would have been possible. And thank you to all of you as well for your time and attention. I hope you'll get in touch with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for giving that wonderful overview of the work that you are doing. And I would also like to mention that we haven't had a discussion or a lecture yet on food insecurity and, of course, the interlinkages with reproductive justice. So for me, it was very informative, and I hope for our audience as well. So first, let me open up the floor to questions. And if anyone has a question, maybe you can put it in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question. Okay, so maybe people are still thinking about their questions. So, let me get the ball rolling by asking you a very fundamental kind of question, because this is a research that is done in the global south, particularly in the Indian context. And there's a question of, food insecurity or security. And your 2 states are UP and Goa, if I remember clearly. So, could you talk a little bit about the reason behind choosing such, very diverse kind of landscapes and foodscapes? And the other is that we have had a lot of discussion and writings from India in terms of the Green Revolution and its connection to food security. So, do you find that kind of impact of the Green Revolution in, these 2 states, if at all?
Thank you. Yeah, those are great questions. I think people are very often interested in why we've picked Goa in particular, right? We've picked a place that is sort of known for actually being a fairly wealthy state. And the reason for that, so there are some theoretical reasons, and then there are some practical reasons as well for those choices, right? So the practical reason, I'll just be very honest with you, the co-investigator on this project is Dr. Sukumar Velakal. He was based at BITS Pilani when we first started thinking about these issues, and then he's moved to IIT Kanpur. So there's a bit of a sort of relevance, and you know, we can't overstate. We like to say that there are all these theoretical reasons for sampling that we do, but in fact, you know, it's really important to have access to field sites and understanding of field sites to be able to collect good data as well. So those practical reasons do matter, and I want to be honest about those. But there are theoretical reasons as well. So we're looking within UP, there's obviously a great diversity and a lot of economic hardship. So, you know, we've used a gatekeeper within UP to be able to access communities that we know that there are high levels of economic precarity, and to be able to look at both rural and urban places, and places where we know that there's going to be food insecurity, right? Goa, we were particularly interested in migrant communities. And the reason for this was, again, amongst all of this sort of wealth that you see in Goa, there are communities, pockets of precarity, pockets of, you know, economic hardship that are occurring within Goa. So we were really interested in, you know, what are their experiences? They're removed from their networks, they're removed from, you know, maybe even familiar foods and familiar food environments, right? What does it mean to be experiencing economic precarity within Goa? So those are sort of the practical and conceptual reasons for those choices as well. In terms of the Green Revolution, I can't say that we have actually seen any impacts. We do have in round two one of the types of data that I didn't talk about, and the team are collecting in round three as well, is focus group data. So we were really asking questions about, you know, who eats first, who eats last, what kinds of foods do you eat? From round two, we also took a kitchen scale into the field and started measuring, you know, okay, so you have this much rice, how long will this last you, and so forth, so we can really understand what families are eating. We weren't asking them a lot about agricultural practices. So in round one, I would say really we don't have any evidence that we could speak to the Green Revolution. But from round two, we're also doing focus groups with farmers. And so one of the things that I think might come out within subsequent rounds as we start to get into the focus group data is exactly those issues. So nothing on that yet, but stay tuned.
Thank you for that. Audience, do you have any questions? Would you like to ask a question to our speaker?
Uh, Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes. Yeah, I raised my hand, so I was just waiting. Yeah. Thank you, Jasmine, for that brilliant presentation. That was really a very interesting topic, and I don't think it's been much explored in India, academically at least. So I am a research fellow with the Global Campaign for Dalit Women, and something that you mentioned towards the beginning of your presentation was about how you were also sort of trying to have a population that where you're covering diverse caste identities or class positions as well. So just wanted to know if caste sort of came up only as a demographic identifier in this case, or if you have any caste specific findings to food security and reproductive rights.
Yeah, so this is going to be another, thank you first of all for your very kind comments. This is another stay tuned answer, I'm afraid. So because it's a preliminary analysis, we really jumped in and just thought, okay, first let's just look at what are the issues. And we've not started sort of picking apart those issues and thinking yet through. So this is exactly why I say it's an exploratory stage. But absolutely, you know, families talked, you know, a lot about issues around sort of food practices that are really relevant to caste. So certainly I think caste is going to come out in the future. We collected the demographic data, but also, of course, between sort of reading between the lines and understanding how people are talking about food and food practices, there's a lot that we'll be able to say about caste in future. I should also emphasize that the team have some really brilliant papers going on right now that are looking at caste and how it matters for things like aspirations and education. So thinking about how parents think about education for their children and how caste matters for that. and how that's linked to food sacrifices and views of things like the midday meal scheme, for example. So there will certainly be more work coming out from about caste from that, and that has direct relevance. So in limiting myself to 40 minutes, there were a lot of things that I actually pulled out of this presentation, and one of those is around parents having to decide between spending money on food or spending money on education-related costs. And I think that's going to come back to caste in a really strong way as well when we start to develop that analysis a bit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deeparati, for the question. And I'm sorry I didn't see the raised hand. Are there any more questions? For some reason, I can't see raised hands. So if anybody else has a question, please feel free to go ahead.
मैम नमस्कार, जैस्मिन मैम नमस्कार।
Namaste.
मैम मेरा जो मीडियम है वो हिंदी मीडियम है। अगर कंफर्टेबल अगर आप लोग हो तो मैं हिंदी में क्वेश्चन पूछ सकता हूँ ना?
I'm sorry, no, my Hindi is really terrible.
मैम मेरा मीडियम हिंदी है।
She is not a very fluent Hindi speaker, is what she's saying. I mean, if you can speak in Hindi, I'll try to translate it. ठीक है, आप बोलिए, मतलब आप बोलिए, मैं हिंदी में ट्रांसलेट करने की कोशिश करूंगी।
थैंक यू मैम, थैंक यू, धन्यवाद आपका मैम। मैम मेरा सवाल भारत के संदर्भ में है। जैसे कि मैम ने बताया कि फूड सिक्योरिटी की बात मैंने रखी, बहुत अच्छा इनका लेक्चर था, बहुत ही अच्छा इनका था। वेरी वेरी थैंक यू आपको भी और मैम को भी। मैम जैसे कि ग्रीन रिवॉल्यूशन के बाद भारत में जो खाद्य उत्पादन बढ़ा, गेहूँ चावल का उत्पादन बहुत बढ़ा और पॉपुलेशन को हम एक अच्छा भोजन, एक पेट भर भोजन उनको दे पाए। लेकिन मैम इतने सालों के बाद, इतने वर्षों के बाद ये जो मैम जो पब्लिक हमारी जो पॉपुलेशन है भारत की वो भी बढ़ी है, खाद्यान्न उत्पादन भी बढ़ा है। तो मैम अब ये देखा गया है कि जैसे भारत आज वर्ल्ड में टॉप स्थान पर आ गया है पॉपुलेशन पर। तो इतनी पॉपुलेशन को मैम हम कैसे भोजन मुहैया कराएंगे? दूसरी बात मैम, जो खाद्य जो उत्पादन हो रहा है, इतने इंसेक्टिसाइड्स पेस्टिसाइड्स इसमें डाले जा रहे हैं। दूसरी तरफ हम एक अच्छे स्वास्थ्य की कल्पना कैसे कर पाएंगे? 2023 में मैम ये जो यूएनओ की ओर से मिलेट ईयर्स घोषित किया गया, मोटे अनाज का उत्पादन। तो मैम ऐसे में हम फूड सिक्योरिटी को भारत के संदर्भ में कैसे देख पाएंगे, कैसे कर पाएंगे मैम?
Okay, so धन्यवाद आपके सवाल के लिए।
जी
Yasmin,
मैम।
I'll just try to roughly translate it to English, although my Hindi is
Thank you.
also not very good. But what he's asking are the linkages between a Green Revolution and how it sort of played a role in curbing India's food insecurity issue. But there is an overpopulation problem in the Indian context. So how can we think about nutritious food for such a huge population, considering also the fact that India is going to be number one in terms of world population, or already it is. So this is the rough gist of what Vipin has asked.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great question. And I think the truth of the matter is we have to stop thinking about India having India's problems and the UK having the UK's problems and the US having the US problems. I think, the UK, the US, the global minority countries are to blame for a lot of the global distributional issues that we have around food. We have enough food for everyone right now. But we're very bad at distributing it. And we have actors in agribusiness in the US, actors like Monsanto, who are eroding food security by, forcing people towards monocropping and, having sort of intellectual property rights on things like seeds, on things like food. These aren't things that are commodities to be, traded and used for capital. These are things that are essential for life. So my answer is ultimately that we have to think collectively on a global scale, and we can't go, okay, well, now this is India's problem.
विपिन, I'll just again मैं थोड़ा सा अनुवाद कर देती हूँ। जो यास्मीन कह रही है कि बेसिक जो दो आई थिंक चीजें हैं, एक है रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन, कि कैसे रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूट किया जा सकता है, एंड दूसरा ये है कि हमें कलेक्टिवली ग्लोबली सोचना पड़ेगा। ये सिर्फ इंडियन इशू नहीं हो सकता है, उसको एक ग्लोबल वर्ल्ड वाइड इशू की तरह ट्रीट करना चाहिए होगा। So I hope I've been able to just translate it so that you are able to get the gist of it. Thank
मैम
you for
थैंक यू
the
आपका,
question.
थैंक यू मैम आपका, बहुत बहुत थैंक यू आपका, जैस्मिन मैम को
Thank
बहुत बहुत
you.
थैंक यू मेरा, धन्यवाद।
Thank you. Thank you.
So there's a question in the chat box from Nandini, and she says that, as mentioned by you over the course of the presentation, culture seems to play a role in contributing to reinforcing food insecurity, like that of preferential treatment. Are there any common cultural practices that the team came across in this context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you're absolutely right. And one of the reasons that we're doing this project is because so much of what we do in the food insecurity literature is to ask one person in the household to answer some questions about everyone's food experiences, right? So we say, okay, do you ever worry about food? Do you ever skip meals? Do you ever do this? Do you ever do that, right? Those items that I talked about on that FOW scale, right? And we ask one person to report, and then we assume that that's the experience for the household, right? So we tend to measure household food insecurity, and even that feast scale that FOW is using, that food insecurity experience scale that FOW is using, that is in principle an individual rather than a household level scale, but they don't deploy it for multiple members of the household, right? So this is why it's so important for us to ask multiple members of the same household. And we see, as we're starting to talk to multiple members of the household, we see some contradictions. We see people having different experiences of food and reporting on different experiences of food within the household. And of course, gender is a huge driver of that, right? So exactly these issues around, women eating last. This is, one example of why we would why we would expect that prevalence of food insecurity when we're using a household measure would actually be lower than if we think about individuals. We would suddenly see a higher level of food insecurity for women because of the practices that they are sort of socioculturally socialized to undertake for the sake of other members of the household, right? So you're exactly right. It's hugely important, and it's part of why it's so important for us to start looking within households and trying to understand what's happening within households. The other thing that I would say is really relevant is particularly for children, children doing things like going to school, whether or not they're carrying a tiffin with them, whether or not they're taking the meal at school. These sorts of practices are potentially relevant as well, right? So we're just starting to get into all of this with the data. But again, it's why it's really important for us to think about children, right? When we start talking about households and measuring household food insecurity, we're not understanding the experiences of children. We don't understand the unique experiences that they have, right? We tend to measure malnutrition for children to the age of 5, and then they sort of disappear from the literature until they become of reproductive age, right? This is hugely problematic for even understanding the cultural issues that children face in food insecurity.
Right, that's a very interesting response. Thank you. So let me check the chat box. Right, there are only 2 comments by Debarati and Nandini. So are there any more questions? Would anyone want to ask a question? I think you've really made us think, primarily because this is again something that we haven't really spoken of much in the Indian context as well as part of this group. So this lecture is immensely helpful, and I would also recommend that you all of us should read more on it and perhaps start with your works and then sort of expand our horizons. So thank you so much for giving this time on a holiday, and I also apologize that we scheduled this talk on Idil Fitr. It's an oversight on my part. I didn't really realize it when the lecture slot was booked. But thank you for attending, and the recording would be uploaded on the ISS YouTube channel, so you can also catch it later. Thank you once again, Jasmine, for doing this and for giving us time.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. It's been lovely.
Okay, bye. Have a good evening, everyone.
Have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.